I did math, and there's 6 chapters left, and there's 3 days of school left. There's no way I'm going to have time to read anything on Wednesday. So, I guess it's more chapters for today if I do 2 more chapters today. That leaves 4 for tomorrow, which means I will have done 4 today and I'll do 4 tomorrow. I'm not complaining. You can watch them whenever you want. Chapter 18. My parents go commando. By the time we got to the street, it was too late. Hunters and campers lay wounded on the ground. Clarice must have lost a fight with a Hyperborean giant because she and her chariot were frozen in a block of ice. The centaurs were nowhere to be seen. Either they'd panicked or ran, or they'd been disintegrated. The Titan army ringed the building, standing maybe 20 feet from the doors. Kronos' vanguard was in the lead. Ethan Nakamura, the Dracaena queen in her green armor, and 2 Hyperboreans. I didn't see Prometheus. The slimy weasel was probably hiding back at their headquarters. But Kronos himself stood right in front with his scythe in hand. The only thing standing in his way was Chiron, Annabeth said, her voice trembling. If Chiron heard us, he didn't answer. He had an arrow notched, aimed straight at Kronos' face. As soon as Kronos saw me, his gold eyes flared. Every muscle in my body froze. Then the Titan Lord turned his attention back to Chiron. Step aside, little son. Hearing Luke call Chiron his son was weird enough, but Kronos put contempt in his voice, like son was the worst word he could think of. I'm afraid not. Chiron's tone was steely calm, the way he gets when he's really angry. I tried to move, but my feet felt like concrete. Annabeth Grover and Thalia were straining too, like they were just as struck. Chiron, Annabeth said. Look out! The Dracaena queen became impatient and charged. Chiron's arrow flew straight between her eyes, and she vaporized on the spot, her empty armor clattering to the asphalt. Chiron reached for another arrow, but his quiver was empty. He dropped the bow and drew his sword. I knew he hated fighting with a sword. It was never his favorite weapon. Kronos chuckled. He advanced a step, and Chiron's horse half skittered nervously. His tail flickered back and forth. You're a teacher, Kronos sneered, not a hero. Luke was a hero, Chiron said. He was a good one, and you corrupted him. Fool! Chiron's voice shook the city. You filled his head with empty promises. You said the gods cared about me. Me, Chiron noticed. You said me. Kronos looked confused, and in that moment Chiron struck. It was a good maneuver, a feint followed by a strike to the face. I couldn't have done better myself, but Kronos was quick. He had all of Luke's fighting skill, which was a lot. He knocked aside Chiron's blade and yelled, Back! A blinding white light exploded between the Titan and the Centaur. Chiron flew into the side of the building with such force the wall crumbled and collapsed on top of him. No! Annabeth wailed. The freezing spell broke. We ran toward our teacher, but there was no sign of him. Thalia and I pulled helplessly at the bricks while a ripple of ugly laughter ran through the Titan's army. You! Annabeth turned to Luke. To think that I thought... She drew her knife. Annabeth, don't! I tried to take her arm, but she shook me off. She attacked Kronos, and his smug smile faded. Perhaps some part of Luke remembered that he used to like this girl. He used to take care of her when she was little. She plunged her knife between the straps of his armor, right in his collarbone. The blade should have sunk into his chest. Instead, it bounced off. Annabeth doubled over, clutching her arm to her stomach. The jolt might have been enough to dislocate her bad shoulder. I yanked her back as Kronos swung his scythe, slicing the air where she'd been standing. She fought me and screamed, I hate you! I wasn't sure who she was talking to, me or Luke or Kronos. Tears streaked the dust on her face. I have to fight him, I told her. It's my fight too, Percy! Kronos laughed. So much spirit. I can see why Luke wanted to spare you. Unfortunately, that won't be possible. He raised his scythe. I got ready to defend, but before Kronos could strike, a dog's howl pierced the air somewhere behind the Titan's army. Aroo! It was too much to hope, but I called, Mrs. O'Leary? The enemy forces stirred uneasily. Then the strangest thing happened. They began to part. clearing a path through the street like something behind them was forcing them to. Soon there was a free aisle down the center of Fifth Avenue. Standing at the back end of the block was my giant dog and a small figure in black armor. Nico? I called. Woof! Mrs. O'Leary bounded toward me, ignoring the growling monsters on either side. Nico strode forward. The enemy army fell back before him like he radiated death, which, of course, he did. Through the face guard of a skull-shaped helmet, he smiled. Got your message. Is it too late to join the party? Son of Hades, Kronos spit on the ground. Do you love death so much you wish to experience it? Your death, Nico said, would be great for me. I'm immortal, you fool. I have escaped Tartarus. You have no business here and no chance to live. Nico drew his sword, 3 feet of wicked sharp Stygian iron, black as nightmare. I don't agree. The ground rumbled. Cracks appeared in the road, the sidewalks, the sides of buildings. Skeletal hands grasped the air as the dead clawed their way into the world of the living. There were thousands of them, and as they emerged, the Titan's monsters got jumpy and started to back up. Hold your ground, Kronos demanded. The dead are no match for us. The sky turned dark and cold. Shadows thickened. A harsh war horn sounded, and as the dead soldiers formed up ranks with their guns and swords and spears, an enormous chariot roared down Fifth Avenue. It came to a stop next to Nico. The horses were living shadows, fashioned from darkness. The chariot was inlaid with obsidian and gold, decorated with scenes of painful death. Holding the reins was Hades himself, Lord of the Dead, with Demeter and Persephone riding behind him. Hades wore black armor and a cloak the color of fresh blood. On top of his pale head was the helm of darkness, a crown that radiated pure terror. It changed shape as I watched, from a dragon's head to a circle of black flames, to a wreath of human bones. But that wasn't the scary part. The helm reached into my mind and ignited my worst nightmares, my most secret fears. I wanted to crawl into a hole and hide, and I could tell the enemy army felt the same way. Only Kronos' power and authority kept his ranks from fleeing. Hades smiled coldly. Hello, father. You're looking young. Hades, Kronos growled. I hope you and the ladies have come to pledge your allegiance. I'm afraid not, Hades sighed. My son here convinced me that perhaps I should prioritize my list of enemies. He glanced at me with distaste. As much as I dislike certain upstart demigods, it would not do for Olympus to fall. I would miss bickering with my siblings, and if there is one thing we agree on, it is that you were a terrible father. True, muttered Demeter. No appreciation of agriculture. Mother, Persephone complained. Hades drew his sword, a double-edged Stygian blade etched with silver. Now fight me, for today the house of Hades will be called the saviors of Olympus. I don't have time for this, Kronos snarled. He struck the ground with his scythe. A crack spread in both directions, encircling the Empire State Building. A wall of force shimmered along the fissure line, separating Kronos' vanguard, my friends and me, from the bulk of the two armies. What's he doing? I muttered. Sealing us in, Thalia said. He's collapsing the magic barriers around Manhattan, cutting off just the building and us. Sure enough, outside the barrier, car engines revved to life. Pedestrians woke up and stared uncomprehendingly at the monsters and zombies all around them. No telling what they saw through the mist. But I'm sure it was plenty scary. Car doors opened, and at the end of the block, Paul Blowfist and my mom got out of their Prius. No, I said, don't! My mother could see through the mist. I could tell from her expression she understood how serious things were. I hoped she would have the sense to run, but she locked eyes with me, said something to Paul, and they ran straight towards us. I couldn't call out. The last thing I wanted to do was bring her to Kronos' attention. Fortunately, Hades caused a distraction. He charged at the wall of force, but his chariot crashed against it and overturned. He got to his feet, cursing, and blasted the wall with black energy. The barrier held. Attack! He roared. The armies of the dead clashed with the Titan's monsters. Fifth Avenue exploded into absolute chaos. Mortals screamed and ran for cover. Demeter waved her hand, and an entire column of giants turned into a wheat field. Persephone changed the Dracenes spears into sunflowers. Nico slashed and hacked his way through the enemy, trying to protect the pedestrians as best he could. My parents ran toward me, dodging monsters and zombies, but there was nothing I could do to help them. Nakamura, Kronos said, attend me. Giants, deal with them. He pointed at my friends and me, then he ducked into the lobby. For a second, I was stunned. I'd been expecting a fight, but Kronos completely ignored me like I wasn't worth the trouble. That made me mad. The first Hyperborean giant smashed at me with his club. I rolled between his legs and stabbed Riptide into his backside. He shattered into a pile of ice shards. The second giant breathed frost at Annabeth, who was barely able to stand, but Grover pulled her out of the way while Thalia went to work. She sprinted up to the giant's back like a gazelle, sliced her hunting knives through his monstrous blue neck, and created the world's largest headless ice sculpture. I glanced outside the magic barrier. Nico was fighting his way toward my mom and Paul, but they weren't waiting for help. Paul grabbed a sword from a fallen hero and did a pretty fine job at keeping Adricina busy. He stabbed her in the gut and she disintegrated. Paul? I said in amazement. He turned toward me and grinned. I hope that was a monster I just killed. I was a Shakespearean actor in college. Picked up a little swordplay. I liked him even better for that, but then a Lastrygonian giant charged towards my mom. She was rummaging around in an abandoned police car. Maybe we're looking for the emergency radio, and her back was turned. Mom! I yelled. She whirled when the monster was almost on top of her. I caught the thing in her hand. I thought the thing in her hand was in an umbrella, until she cranked the pump and the shotgun blast blew the giant 20 feet backwards, right into Nico's sword. Nice one, Paul said. When did you learn to fire a shotgun? I demanded. My mom blew the hair out of her face. About 2 seconds ago. Percy, we'll be fine. Go! Yes. Yeah, Nico said. We'll handle the army. You have to get Kronos. Come on, Seaweed Brain, Annabeth said. I nodded. Then I looked at the rubble pile on the side of the building. My heart twisted. I'd forgotten about Chiron. How could I do that? Mrs. O'Leary, I said, please, Chiron's under there. If anyone can dig him out, you can. Find him. Help him. I wasn't sure how much she understood, but she bounded to the pile and started to dig. Annabeth, Thalia, Grover, and I raced for the elevators. Chapter 19. We trashed the Eternal City. If you've ever wondered what a climax of a book is, this section right here, this section right here, we are well past rising action. We're at the top of the mountain now. We're still getting exposition. See, exposition does not stop in the middle. We trashed the Eternal City. The bridge to Olympus was dissolving. We stepped out of the elevator onto white marble walkway and immediately cracks appeared at our face. Feet, not face, feet. Jump! Grover said, which was easy for him since he's part mountain goat. He sprang to the next slab of stone while ours tilted sickeningly. Gods, I hate heights! Thalia yelled as she and I leapt. But Annabeth was in no shape for jumping. She stumbled and yelled, Percy! I caught her hand as the pavement fell, crumbling into dust. For a second I thought she was going to pull us both over. Her feet dangled in the open air. Her hand started to slip until I was holding her by only her fingers. Then Grover and Thalia grabbed my legs and I found extra strength. Annabeth was not going to fall. I pulled her up and we lay trembling on the pavement. I didn't realize we had our arms around each other until she suddenly tensed. Thanks, she muttered. I tried to say, don't mention it, but it came out as, Keep moving, Grover tugged my shoulder. We untangled ourselves and sprinted across the sky bridge as more stones disintegrated and fell into oblivion. We made it to the edge of the mountain just as the final section collapsed. Annabeth looked back at the elevator, which was now completely out of reach. A polished set of metal doors hanging in space, attached to nothing, 600 stories above Manhattan. We're marooned, she said. On our own. Blah, Grover said. The connection between Olympus and America is dissolving. If it fails... The gods won't move on to another country this time, Thalia said. This will be the end of Olympus. The final end. We ran through the streets. Mansions were burning, statues being hacked down. Trees in the parks were blasted to splinters. It looked like someone had attacked the city with a giant weed whacker. Kronos' scythe, I said. We followed the winding path toward the palace of the gods. I didn't remember the road being so long. Maybe Kronos was making time go slower here, or maybe it was just dread slowing me down. The whole mountaintop was in ruins. So many beautiful buildings and gardens gone. A few minor gods and nature spirits had tried to stop Kronos. What remained of them was strewn about the road, shattered armor, ripped clothing, swords and spears broken in half. Somewhere ahead of us, Kronos' voice roared. Brick by brick. That was my promise. Tear it down, brick by brick. A white marble temple with a gold dome suddenly exploded. The dome shot up like the lid of a teapot and shattered into a billion pieces, raining rubble over the city. That was a shrine to Artemis, Thalia grumbled. He'll pay for that. We were running under the marble archway with the huge statues of Zeus and Hera when the entire mountain groaned, rocking sideways like a boat in a storm. Look out! Grover yelped. The archway crumbled. I looked up in time to see a 20-ton scowling Hera topple over us. Annabeth and I would have been flattened, but Thalia shoved us from behind and we landed just out of danger. Thalia! Grover cried. When the dust cleared, the mountain stopped rocking. We found her still alive, but her legs were pinned under the statue. We desperately tried to move it, but it would have taken several cyclopes. When we tried to pull Thalia out from under it, she yelled in pain. I survive all those battles, she growled, and I get defeated by a stupid chunk of rock. It's Hera, Annabeth said in outrage. She's had it in for me all year. Her statue would have killed me if you hadn't pushed us away. Thalia grimaced. Well, don't just stand there. I'll be fine. Go! We didn't want to leave her, but I could hear Kronos laughing as he approached the Hall of the Gods. More buildings exploded. We'll be back, I promised. I'm not going anywhere, Thalia groaned. A fireball erupted on the side of the mountain, right near the gates of the palace. We've got to run, I said. I don't suppose you mean away, Grover murmured hopefully. I sprinted toward the palace, Annabeth right behind me. I was afraid of that, Grover sighed and clip-clopped after us. The doors of the palace were big enough to steer a cruise ship through, but they'd been ripped off their hinges and smashed like they weighed nothing. We had to climb over a huge pile of broken stone and twisted metal to get inside. Kronos stood in the middle of the throne room, his arms wide, staring at the starry ceiling, as if taking it all in. His laughter echoed even louder than it had from the pit of Tartarus. Finally, he bellowed, the Olympian Council, so proud and mighty. Which seat of power shall I destroy first? Ethan Nakamura stood to one side, trying to stay out of the way of his master's scythe. The hearth was almost dead, just a few coals glowing deep in the ashes. Hestia was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Rachel. I hoped she was okay, but I'd seen so much destruction I was afraid to think about it. The Ophiotaurus swam in his water sphere in the far corner of the room, wisely not making a sound, but it wouldn't be long before Kronos noticed him. Annabeth, Grover, and I stepped forward into the torchlight. Ethan saw us first. My lord, he warned. Kronos turned and smiled through Luke's face. Except for the golden eyes, he looked just the same as he had 4 years ago when he'd welcomed me to the Hermes cabin. Annabeth made a painful sound in the back of her throat like someone had just sucker punched her. Shall I destroy you first, Jackson? Kronos asked. Is that the choice you will make? To fight me and die instead of bowing down? Prophecies never end well, you know. Luke would fight with a sword, I said, but I suppose you don't have the skill. Kronos sneered. His scythe began to change until he held Luke's old weapon, Backbiter, with its half-steel, half-celestial bronze blade. Next to me, Annabeth gasped like she'd had an idea. Percy, the blade! She unsheathed her knife. The hero's soul, cursed blade shall reap. I didn't understand why she was reminding me of that prophecy line until now. I didn't understand why she was reminding me of that prophecy line right now. It wasn't exactly a morale booster, but before I could say anything, Kronos raised his sword. Wait! Annabeth yelled. Kronos came after me like a whirlwind. My instincts took over. I dodged and slashed and rolled, but I felt like I was fighting 100 swordsmen. Ethan ducked to one side, trying to get behind me until Annabeth intercepted him. They started to fight, but I couldn't focus on how she was doing. I was vaguely aware of Grover playing his reed pipes. The sound filled me with warmth and courage, thoughts of sunlight and blue sky and a calm meadow somewhere far, far away from the war. Kronos backed me up against the throne of Hephaestus, a huge mechanical lazy-boy type thing covered with bronze and silver gears. Kronos slashed, and I managed to jump straight up onto the seat. The throne whirred and hummed with secret mechanisms. Defense mode, it warned. Defense mode. That couldn't be good. I jumped straight over Kronos' head as the throne shot tendrils of electricity in all directions. One hit Kronos in the face, arcing his body and up his sword. Down his body and up his sword, my goodness. Aye! He crumpled to his knees and dropped Backbiter. Annabeth saw her chance. She kicked Ethan out of the way and charged Kronos. Luke, listen! I wanted to shout at her to tell her she was crazy for trying to reason with Kronos, but there was no time. Kronos flicked his hand. Annabeth flew backwards, slamming into the throne of her mother and crumpling to the floor. Annabeth! I screamed. Ethan Nakamura got to his feet. He now stood between Annabeth and me. I couldn't fight him without turning my back on Kronos. Grover's music took an even more urgent tune. He moved toward Annabeth, but he couldn't go any faster and keep up the song. Grass grew on the floor of the throne room. Tiny roots crept up between the cracks of the marble stones. Kronos rose to one knee. His hair smoldered. His face was covered with electrical burns. He reached for his sword, but this time it didn't fly into his hands. Nakamura, he groaned. Time to prove yourself. You know Jackson's secret weakness. Kill him and you will have rewards beyond measure. Ethan's eyes dropped to my midsection and I was sure that he knew. Even if he couldn't kill me himself, all he had to do was tell Kronos. There was no way I could defend myself forever. Look around you, Ethan, I said. The end of the world. Is this the reward you want? Do you really want everything destroyed? The good with the bad? Everything? Grover was almost to Annabeth now. The long grass thickened on the floor. The roots were almost a foot long, like a stubble of whiskers. There's no throne to Nemesis, Ethan muttered. No throne to my mother. That's right! Kronos tried to get up, but stumbled. Above his left ear, a patch of blonde hair still smoldered. Strike them down! They deserve to suffer! You said your mom is the goddess of balance, I reminded him. The minor gods deserve better, Ethan, but total destruction isn't balance. Kronos doesn't build. He only destroys. Ethan looked at the sizzling throne of Hephaestus. Grover's music kept playing, and Ethan swayed to it as if the song were filling him with nostalgia. A wish to see a beautiful day, to be anything but here. His good eye blinked. Then he charged, but not at me. While Kronos was still on his knees, Ethan brought down his sword on the Titan Lord's neck. It should have killed him instantly, but the blade shattered. Ethan fell back, grasping his stomach. A shard of his own blade had ricocheted and pierced his armor. Kronos rose unsteadily, towering over his servant. Treason! He snarled. Grover's music kept playing, and the grass grew around Ethan's body. Ethan stared at me, his face tight with pain. Deserve better, he gasped. If they just had thrones. Kronos stomped his foot, and the floor ruptured around Ethan Nakamura. The son of Nemesis fell through a fissure that went straight through the heart of the mountain, straight into open air. So much for him. Kronos picked up his sword. And now for the rest of you. My only thought was to keep him away from Annabeth. Grover was at her side now. He stopped playing and was feeding her ambrosia. Everywhere Kronos stepped, the roots wrapped around his feet, but Grover had stopped his magic too early. The roots weren't thick or strong enough to do much more than annoy the Titan. We fought through the hearth, kicking up coals and sparks. Kronos slashed the armrest off the throne of Ares, which was okay by me, but then he backed up to my father's throne. Oh yes, Kronos said. This one will make fine kindling for my new hearth. Our blades clashed in a shower of sparks. He was stronger than me, but for the moment I felt the power of the ocean in my arms. I pushed him back and struck, again, slashing Riptide across his breastplate so hard I cut a gash in the celestial bronze. He stomped his foot again and time slowed. I tried to attack, but I was moving at the speed of a glacier. Kronos backed up leisurely, catching his breath. He examined the gash in his armor while I struggled forward, silently cursing him. He could take all the time out he wanted. He could freeze me in place at will. My only hope was that the effort was draining him. If I could wear him down... It's too late, Percy Jackson, he said. Behold! He pointed to the hearth and the coals glowed. A sheet of white smoke poured from the fire, forming images like an iris message. I saw Nico and my parents down on Fifth Avenue, fighting a hopeless battle, ringed in enemies. In the background, Hades fought from his black chariot, summoning wave after wave of zombies out of the ground, but the forces of the Titan's army seemed just as endless. Meanwhile, Manhattan was being destroyed. Mortals, now fully awake, were running in terror. Cars swerved and crashed. The scene shifted, and I saw something even more terrifying. A column of storm was approaching the Hudson River, moving rapidly over the Jersey shore. Chariots circled it, locked in combat with the creature in the cloud. The gods attacked. Lightning flashed. Arrows of gold and silver streaked into the cloud like rocket tracers and exploded. Suddenly the cloud ripped apart and I saw Typhon clearly for the first time. I knew as long as I lived, which might not be that long, I would never be able to get the image out of my mind. Typhon's head shifted constantly. Every moment he was a different monster, each more horrible than the last. Looking at his face would have driven me insane, so I focused on his body, which wasn't much better. He was humanoid, but his skin reminded me of a meatloaf sandwich that had been in someone's locker all year. He was a mottled green with blisters the size of buildings and blackened patches from eons of being stuck under a volcano. His hands were human, but with talons like an eagle's. His legs were scaly and reptilian. The Olympians are giving their final effort, Kronos laughed. How pathetic. Zeus threw a thunderbolt from his chariot. The blast lit up the world. I could feel the shock even here on Olympus. When the dust cleared, Typhon was still standing. He staggered a bit with a smoking crater on top of his massive, misshapen head, but he roared in anger and kept advancing. My limbs began to loosen up. Kronos didn't seem to notice. His attention was focused on the fight and his final victory. If I could hold out a few more seconds, if my dad kept his word. Typhon stepped into the Hudson River and barely sank to mid-calf. Now, I thought, imploring the image in the smoke. Please, it happened. Has to happen. Now. Like a miracle, a conchorn sounded from the smoky picture. The call of the ocean. The call of Poseidon. All around Typhon, the Hudson River erupted, churning with 40-foot waves. Out of the water burst a new chariot, this one pulled by massive hippocampi, who swam in the air as easily as on water. In water, my father, glowing with a blue aura of power, rode a defiant circle around the giant's legs. Poseidon was no longer an old man. He looked like himself again, tan and strong with a black beard. As he swung his trident, the river responded, making a funnel cloud around the monster. No! Kronos bellowed after a moment of sudden silence. No! Now, my brethren! Poseidon's voice was so loud I wasn't sure if I was hearing it from the smoke image or all the way across town. Strike for Olympus! Warriors burst out of the river, riding the waves on huge sharks and dragons and seahorses. It was a legion of Cyclopes, and leading them into battle was Typhon. I knew he couldn't hear me, but I stared at him in amazement. He'd magically grown in size. He had to be 30 feet tall, as big as his other older cousins. But for the first time, he was wearing full battle armor. Riding behind him was Briareus, the hundred-handed one. All the Cyclopes held huge lengths of black iron chains, big enough to anchor a battleship, with grappling hooks at the ends. They swung them like lassos and began to ensnare Typhon, throwing lines around the creature's legs and arms and using the tide to keep circling, slowly tangling him. Typhon shook and roared and yanked at the chains, pulling some of the Cyclopes off their mounts, but there were too many chains. The sheer weight of the Cyclopes battalion began to weigh Typhon down. Poseidon threw his trident and impaled the monster in the throat. Golden blood, immortal ichor, spewed from the wound, making a waterfall taller than a skyscraper. The trident flew back to Poseidon's hand. The other gods struck with renewed force. Ares rode in and stabbed Typhon in the nose. Artemis shot that monster in the eye with 12 silver arrows. Apollo shot a blazing volley of arrows and set the monster's loincloth on fire. And Zeus kept pounding the giant with lightning until finally, slowly, the water rose, wrapping Typhon like a cocoon, and he began to sink under the weight of the chains. Typhon bellowed in agony, thrashing with such force that waves sloshed the Jersey shore, soaking 5-story buildings and splashing over the George Washington Bridge. But down he went as my dad opened a special tunnel for him at the bottom of the river, an endless waterslide that would take him straight to Tartarus. The giant's head went under in a seething whirlpool, and he was gone. Bah! Kronos screamed. He slashed his sword through the smoke, tearing the image to shreds. They're on their way, I said. You've lost. They're on their way, I said. You've lost. I haven't even started. He advanced with blinding speed. Grover, brave, stupid satyr that he was, tried to protect me, but Kronos tossed him aside like a rag doll. I sidestepped and jabbed under Kronos' guard. It was a good trick. Unfortunately, Luke knew it. He countered the strike and disarmed me using one of the first moves he'd ever taught me. My sword skittered across the ground and fell straight into the open fissure. Stop! Annabeth came from nowhere. Kronos whirled to face her and slashed with Backbiter, but somehow Annabeth caught the strike on her dagger hilt. It was a move that only the quickest and most skilled knife fighter could have managed. Don't ask me where she found the strength, but she stepped in closer for leverage. Their blades crossed, and for a moment she stood face to face with the Titan Lord, holding him at a standstill. Luke, she said through gritting her teeth, I understand now. You have to trust me. Kronos roared in outrage. Luke Castellan is dead. His body will burn away as I assume my true form. I tried to move, but my body was frozen again. How could Annabeth, battered and half dead with exhaustion, have the strength to fight a titan like Kronos? Kronos pushed against her, trying to dislodge his blade, but she held him in check, her arms trembling as he forced his sword down towards her neck. Your mother, Annabeth grunted. She saw your fate. Service to Kronos, the Titan roared. This is my fate. No, Annabeth insisted. Her eyes were tearing up, but I didn't know if it was from sadness or pain. That's not the end, Luke. The prophecy. She saw what you would do. It applies to you. I will crush you, child, Kronos bellowed. You won't, Annabeth said. You promised. You're holding back Kronos even now. Lies! Kronos pushed again, and this time Annabeth lost her balance. With his free hand, Kronos struck her face, and she slid backwards. I summoned all my will. I managed to rise, but it was like holding the weight of the sky again. Kronos loomed over Annabeth, his sword raised. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. She croaked, Family, Luke, you promised. I took a painful step forward. Grover was back on his feet, over by the throne of Hera, but he seemed to be struggling to move as well. Before either of us could get anywhere close to Annabeth, Kronos staggered. He stared at the knife in Annabeth's hand, the blood on her face. Promise. And he gasped like he couldn't get air. Annabeth! But it wasn't the Titan's voice. It was Luke's. He stumbled forward like he couldn't control his own body. You're bleeding. My knife! Annabeth tried to raise her dagger, but it clattered out of her hand. Her arm was bent at a funny angle. She looked at me, imploring. Percy, please. I could move again. I surged forward and scooped up her knife. I knocked Backbiter out of Luke's hand, and it spun into the hearth. Luke hardly paid me any attention. He stepped towards Annabeth, but I put myself between him and her. Don't touch her, I said. Anger rippled across his face. Kronos' voice growled. Jackson. Was it my imagination, or was his whole body glowing, turning gold? He gasped again. Luke's voice. He's changing. Help! He's almost ready. He won't need my body anymore, please. No! Kronos bellowed. He looked around for his sword, but it was in the hearth, glowing among the coals. He stumbled towards it. I tried to stop him, but he pushed me out of the way with such force I landed next to Annabeth and cracked my head on the base of Athena's throne. The knife, Percy, Annabeth muttered. Her voice was shallow. Hero, cursed blade. When my vision came back into focus, I saw Kronos gripping his sword. Then he bellowed in pain and dropped it. His hands were smoking and seared. The hearth fire had grown red hot, like the scythe wasn't compatible with it. I saw an image of Hestia flickering in the ashes, frowning at Kronos with disapproval. Luke turned and collapsed, clutching his ruined hands. Please, Percy. I struggled to my feet. I moved towards him with the knife. I should kill him. That was the plan. Luke seemed to know what I was thinking. He moistened his lips. You can't do it yourself. He'll break my control. He'll defend himself. Only my hand. I know where. I can keep him controlled. He was definitely glowing now, his skin starting to smoke. I raised the knife to strike. Then I looked at Annabeth, at Grover cradling her in his arms, trying to shield her. And I finally understand what she'd been trying to tell me. You are not the hero, Rachel had said. It will affect what you do. Please, Luke groaned. No time. If Kronos evolved into his true form, there would be no stopping him. He would make Typhon look like a playground bully. The line from the great prophecy echoed in my head. A hero's soul cursed blade shall reap. My whole world tipped upside down, and I gave the knife to Luke. Grover yelped. Percy, are you, crazy? Insane? Off my rocker? Probably. But I watched as Luke grasped the hilt. I stood before him, defenseless. He unlatched the side straps of his armor, exposing a small bit of his skin just under his left arm, a place that would be very hard to hit. With difficulty, he stabbed himself. It wasn't a deep cut, but Luke howled. His eyes glowed like lava. The throne room shook, throwing me off my feet. An aura of energy surrounded Luke, growing brighter and brighter. I shut my eyes and felt a force like a nuclear explosion blister my skin and crack my lips. It was silent for a long time. When I opened my eyes, I saw Luke sprawled at the hearth. On the floor around him was a blackened circle of ash. Kronos' scythe had liquefied into molten metal and was trickling into the coals of the hearth, which now glowed like a blacksmith's furnace. Luke's left side was bloody. His eyes were open, blue eyes, the way they used to be. His breath was a deep rattle. "Good blade," he croaked. I knelt next to him. Annabeth limped over with Grover's support. They both had tears in their eyes. Luke gazed at Annabeth. "You knew. I almost killed you, but you knew." "Shh." Her voice trembled. "You were a hero at the end, Luke. You'll go to Elysium." He shook his head weakly. "Think rebirth. Try for 3 times. Isle of the Blessed." Annabeth sniffled. "You always pushed yourself too hard." He held up his charred hand. Annabeth touched his fingertips. "Did you..." Luke coughed and his lips glistened red. "Did you love me?" Annabeth wiped her tears away. "There was a time I thought... She looked at me like she was drinking in the fact that I was still there. And I realized I was doing the same thing. The world was collapsing, and the only thing that really mattered to me was that she was alive." "You were like a brother to me, Luke," she said softly. "But I didn't love you." He nodded as if he'd expected it. He winced in pain. We can get ambrosia," Grover said. Grover," Luke said. Luke gulped. "You're the bravest satyr I ever knew, but no. There's no healing." Another cough. He gripped my sleeve, and I could feel the heat of his skin like a fire. "Ethan, me, all the unclaimed. Don't let it happen again." His eyes were angry, but pleading too. "I won't," I said. "I promise." Luke nodded, and his face went slack. The gods arrived a few minutes later in their full war regalia, thundering into the throne room and expecting a battle. What they found were Annabeth, Grover, and me standing over the body of a broken half-blood in the dim, warm light of the hearth. "Percy," my father called, awe in his voice. What is this?" I turned and faced the Olympians. "We need a shroud," I announced, my voice cracking. "A shroud for the son of Hermes." And that is the end of chapter 19. Chapter 20 remains. We win fabulous prizes. Chapter 21, chapter 22, and chapter 23. And that's the it. 4 chapters left. I'll read them tomorrow, apparently. And then it's over.